9 Golden Age actresses who aged terribly. The lights of Hollywood have always burned brightest on its beautiful women, capturing their perfect features and flawless skin in silver nitrate perfection that promised to make them immortal. But the cruel reality of time waits for no one, not even the goddesses of the silver screen. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the shocking transformations of 9 legendary actresses whose golden years were anything but golden. These weren't just subtle changes or graceful transitions. These were devastating physical declines that left fans gasping and photographers scrambling. While their films preserved their youth forever, their mirror told a different, more brutal story. From bombshells who refused to surrender their sex appeal long after it had vanished to screen queens destroyed by substances and stress, these are the heartbreaking final chapters of Hollywood's most gorgeous leading ladies. And wait until you see number 1. Her transformation was so extreme that even her closest friends barely recognized her in her final public appearances.
You don't know how to get a meal, you don't know how to keep a secret, and you can't even stay out of town.
Thanks.
I know 50 times as much about trouble as you ever will.
9. Veronica Lake. From signature style to forgotten face. The year was 1941, and no hairstyle in America was more famous or more copied than Veronica Lake's peekaboo look. That cascading blonde wave that fell seductively over one eye, making women across the country rush to their salons demanding the Lake look. As the star of film noir classics like This Gun for Hire and comedies like Sullivan's Travels, Lake wasn't just famous. She was iconic. With her perfect features, sensual presence, and that signature hair, Lake embodied a cool, mysterious sexuality that seemed designed specifically for the camera's loving gaze. Standing just 4 feet 11 inches, she was a tiny package of outsized glamour. Studio publicists called her the girl with the perfect face, and few argued with that assessment. But Veronica Lake's descent from that pinnacle would become one of Hollywood's most shocking and rapid declines. By the early 1950s, just a decade after her rise to stardom, Lake's career was already in serious trouble. Her difficult reputation, she was notorious for being combative on set, combined with changing audience tastes, made her less and less castable. But the real devastation was happening away from the cameras. Lake's struggle with alcohol began to visibly age her once perfect features. The crystal clear blue eyes that had hypnotized audiences became puffy and dull. Her flawless complexion coarsened. Most shockingly, the famous blonde locks, her literal trademark, became brittle and damaged, eventually forcing her to cut off the peekaboo style entirely. The drinking was destroying her from the inside out, revealed Lake's co-star from her later years, Richard Denning. You could literally see it changing her face from month to month. It was like watching a flower wilt in time-lapse photography. By 1962, Lake's fall from grace had reached its nadir when a reporter found the former star working as a cocktail waitress at the Martha Washington Hotel in New York. The woman serving drinks was almost unrecognizable as the sultry film noir queen of just 20 years earlier. Photographs from this period show a bloated face with sunken eyes and a weary expression that made her appear 2 decades older than her actual age. She was once unforgettable until Hollywood forgot her, observed film historian Margaret Wilson, and the physical transformation was the visible manifestation of that abandonment. Lake attempted a comeback in the late 1960s, but audiences were shocked by her appearance. The perfect oval face had become jowly and puffy. The seductive, knowing eyes appeared vacant. Most distressingly, her once flawless skin showed the ravages of alcoholism and poverty, deeply lined, with broken capillaries and an unhealthy pallor. By the time Lake died in 1973 at just 50 years old, she was suffering from hepatitis and acute renal failure, the physical toll of years of alcohol abuse. In her final photographs, the woman once considered among Hollywood's most beautiful was virtually unrecognizable, her face a roadmap of hard living and despair. What makes Lake's physical decline particularly poignant is how completely it erased her most famous feature. The woman whose hair had launched millions of imitations died with her signature style long gone. Her beauty faded to the point that even dedicated fans would have walked past her on the street without a second glance. As her friend and fellow actress Marsha Hunt later observed, "In this town, when your face is your fortune and that face changes, they don't just forget you, they actively avoid you, as if aging might be contagious." Veronica Lake, the girl with the perfect face, discovered the brutal truth that in Hollywood, perfection isn't just demanded, it's expected to be eternal. And when it isn't, the fall is all the more devastating.
Addie Ross left town today. Took somebody's husband with her.
Yeah?
You seem real excited about it, like I told you we were having lamb for dinner.
8. Linda Darnell, beauty that burned out. When Linda Darnell arrived in Hollywood at age 15, studio executives were so stunned by her beauty that they initially lied about her age, claiming she was 17 to avoid child labor laws. With her flawless olive skin, luminous dark eyes, and perfectly symmetrical features, Darnell wasn't just pretty, she possessed a rare, exotic beauty that the camera adored. 20th Century Fox chief Darryl F. Zanuck dubbed her the girl with the perfect face, and throughout the 1940s, that face graced dozens of hit films, including Blood and Sand with Tyrone Power and Forever Amber. Her beauty was so remarkable that renowned director Otto Preminger once said, "The camera worships her face. It's almost impossible to photograph her badly." But behind Darnell's perfect features lurked deep insecurities that would eventually contribute to one of Hollywood's most tragic physical declines. The first cracks in Darnell's flawless facade began to appear in the early 1950s as studio roles became less frequent. Like many actresses facing the industry's brutal aging standards, Darnell turned to alcohol for comfort. The effects quickly became visible in her once perfect complexion. The luminous skin that had required almost no makeup began to show signs of bloating and puffiness. Linda was one of those rare natural beauties who needed very little enhancement, recalled her makeup artist from the 1940s, Thomas Richards. But by 52 or 53, we were having to work much harder to achieve the same effect. The freshness was fading faster than anyone expected. As her career options narrowed, Darnell fell into a cycle of depression, drinking, and dramatic weight fluctuations that accelerated her physical transformation. The slender, elegant silhouette that had graced magazine covers gave way to an increasingly heavy frame. Her once defined jawline softened, and her expressive eyes began to appear smaller in her changing face. The weight gain hit her confidence terribly, revealed her friend and co-star Constance Moore. Linda had been cast as the beautiful one her entire life. When that began to change, she didn't know who she was anymore. Photographs from the mid-1950s show a woman almost unrecognizable from the ethereal beauty of just a decade earlier. The perfect oval face had rounded, the sleek figure had thickened, and most noticeably, the confidence and sparkle that had animated her features had dimmed considerably. What makes Darnell's physical transformation particularly heartbreaking was how premature it was. Unlike many actresses who faced the natural effects of aging over decades, Darnell's decline happened with shocking speed. By her late 30s, when many actresses were still in their prime, she looked noticeably worn and much older than her years. The final chapter of Darnell's transformation came with brutal suddenness. In 1965, at just 41 years old, she was watching her own film Stardust on late-night television when the house caught fire. Darnell suffered severe burns over 90% of her body and died the next day. The tragic irony wasn't lost on those who knew her story. The woman once celebrated for having the perfect face died while watching images of her younger, more beautiful self on screen. The ultimate collision of Hollywood's promised immortality with the harsh reality of physical decline. As her friend and fellow actress Ruth Warrick later observed, Linda was the cautionary tale we all feared becoming. Once the girl with the perfect face ended in tragedy and scars. The studio system built her up as flawless, which meant any flaw afterward seemed magnified. It was a cruel standard no human could maintain. In the most heartbreaking twist, Darnell once told an interviewer, "I don't want to wait until I'm 50 to start playing character parts. I'd rather be dead." Her wish came true in the most terrible way imaginable.
Oh, you're in love. For the first time?
Yes, Your Majesty.
Well, then how do you know? How can you be sure of it? You've nothing to compare it with.
7. Tallulah Bankhead, the voice and face that crumbled. When Tallulah Bankhead burst onto the Hollywood scene in the 1930s, she wasn't just beautiful, she was electrifying. With her patrician features, smoky voice, and scandalous wit, Bankhead embodied a sophisticated sexuality that set her apart from the typical studio starlet. The daughter of a prominent political family, she brought an aristocratic bearing to her performances in films like Lifeboat and stage triumphs like The Little Foxes. In her prime, Bankhead possessed a unique, angular beauty, high cheekbones, expressive eyes, and a tall, slender figure that wore the latest fashions to perfection. But more distinctive than even her looks was her voice, a deep, melodious instrument that could purr or command with equal effectiveness. But Tallulah Bankhead didn't just live hard, she lived harder than perhaps any other actress of her generation. And the toll of that lifestyle would eventually be written across her once beautiful face in ways that shocked even her most devoted fans. Bankhead was famously quoted as saying, "My father warned me about men and booze, but he never mentioned a word about women and cocaine." This wasn't just a witty line, it was a glimpse into the excesses that would eventually destroy her looks and health. A dedicated chain smoker from her teenage years, Bankhead reportedly went through 100 cigarettes a day for decades. This alone would have been enough to ravage her appearance, but it was just one element of her self-destructive routine. She drank bourbon continuously, used cocaine and amphetamines regularly, and slept with partners of both sexes in quantities that even her libertine peers found shocking. By her early 40s, the physical evidence of this lifestyle had begun to appear. The smooth, aristocratic complexion developed deep lines, particularly around her mouth from constant smoking. Her once bright eyes grew increasingly hooded and bloodshot. Most dramatically, her voice, that famous instrument, began to deepen and roughen into what one critic cruelly but accurately described as a cross between a crow's caw and sandpaper on wood. The voice was the first thing to go, recalled her friend and fellow actress Estelle Winwood. What had been sultry and distinctive became harsh and grating. It was painful to hear, especially for those of us who remembered how captivating it had once been. As Bankhead entered her 50s, the transformation accelerated dramatically. The elegant, angular face became increasingly gaunt as her health problems multiplied. Her skin, once porcelain, developed a gray, ashen quality that makeup could no longer disguise. Her slender figure grew alarmingly thin, giving her a fragile, almost skeletal appearance that was accentuated by her continued insistence on wearing revealing, youthful clothing. Most disturbing was the deterioration of her once perfect teeth, damaged by years of neglect and substance abuse. In her later television appearances, viewers were shocked to see Bankhead's dental problems clearly visible when she smiled or spoke, a stark contrast to the perfect Hollywood grins to which audiences were accustomed. By the 1960s, when Bankhead made her final film appearances, the transformation was complete and devastating. The glamorous, sophisticated beauty had been replaced by a figure that director Ryan Thompson described as a Halloween version of her former self, the skin drawn tight over prominent bones, the voice a rasp, the movements jerky and uncertain. What made Bankhead's physical decline particularly notable was her absolute refusal to acknowledge it or modify her behavior. Until the very end, she maintained her hard-drinking, heavy-smoking lifestyle, quipping, "If I had to live my life again, I'd make the same mistakes, only sooner." When Bankhead died in 1968 at age 66, the death certificate listed multiple causes: pneumonia, emphysema, malnutrition, and untreated diabetes. Her body, like her once beautiful face, had been systematically destroyed by decades of excess. As her niece later observed, the flame burned hot and fast. Tallulah lived more in a day than most people live in a year, but that pace exacted a terrible physical price. The vibrant beauty became a cautionary tale about mortality catching up, no matter how famous or talented you are. In Bankhead's own defiant words from her final interview, "Nobody can say I didn't live." The tragic postscript is that nobody could say she aged well either.
I'm very organized because you couldn't live. I'm really a very hard-working actress, believe it or not, and I travel all around the world.
6. Zsa Zsa Gabor, from glamour queen to silicone sculpture. When Hungarian bombshell Zsa Gabor arrived in Hollywood in the early 1940s, she brought with her a European sophistication and beauty that instantly set tongues wagging. With her platinum blonde hair, curvaceous figure, and exotic accent, Gabor wasn't just beautiful, she was opulently, extravagantly gorgeous. In her prime, Gabor possessed the kind of vivacious beauty that seemed to light up rooms. Her heart-shaped face, with its high cheekbones and captivating eyes, graced films like Moulin Rouge and Touch of Evil. But it was her larger-than-life personality and her 9 marriages that made her a household name even more than her acting. "Darling, in my day, I was considered a great beauty," Gabor often reminded interviewers well into her later years. The tragedy is that her desperate attempts to maintain that beauty would eventually transform her into someone unrecognizable from the natural stunner she had once been. Gabor was one of Hollywood's earliest and most enthusiastic adopters of plastic surgery. What began as subtle maintenance in her 40s evolved into an increasingly dramatic series of procedures that fundamentally altered her appearance with each passing decade. By the 1970s, the changes were becoming noticeable. The once mobile, expressive face began to show signs of tightening. The natural contours of her cheekbones, which had been one of her most striking features, began to appear artificially enhanced. Her lips, previously in perfect proportion to her face, started to exhibit the puffy, overfilled appearance that would later become her most distinctive feature. Zsa was beautiful enough to age naturally and still be stunning, observed her makeup artist from the 1960s, Thomas Blake. But she had this pathological fear of looking old. Each procedure was meant to turn back time, but together, they ended up creating something that didn't look like any age. It didn't look human. The transformation accelerated dramatically in the 1980s and 1990s. Photographs from this period show a face increasingly frozen and mask-like. The once subtle contours of her cheekbones became dramatically pronounced, creating an almost feline appearance. Her eyes, which had been wide and expressive, now appeared perpetually stretched and surprised due to excessive lifting procedures. Most dramatically, her lips expanded to proportions that bore no resemblance to her original features. The natural Cupid's bow that had been admired in her youth was replaced by an inflated, undifferentiated shape that moved unnaturally when she spoke. She went from glam queen to silicone sculpture, noted celebrity photographer Richard Barnett, who documented Gabor over several decades. The tragedy was watching the real Zsa disappear by degrees, replaced by this increasingly artificial creation that seemed more like a caricature than a person. What made Gabor's transformation particularly poignant was how unnecessary it had been. Film historians frequently note that her natural beauty, with minimal intervention, would likely have aged with the kind of European sophistication seen in contemporaries like Ingrid Bergman or Audrey Hepburn. Instead, her fear of aging pushed her toward interventions that ultimately erased her natural beauty entirely. The final chapter of Gabor's physical transformation came after a 2002 car accident and subsequent stroke, which left her partially paralyzed. In her last public appearances before becoming completely housebound, the combined effects of her surgeries and health problems created an appearance so altered that many fans expressed shock and sadness at the transformation. When Gabor died in 2016 at age 99, she had lived for decades as a shadow of her former self, physically present but almost completely transformed from the vibrant beauty who had once captivated Hollywood. As her friend and fellow Hungarian actress Eva Bartók observed, Zsa's tragedy wasn't that she aged, it's that she feared aging so much that she erased herself in the process of trying to stop it. The procedures didn't preserve her youth, they replaced her identity. In a culture that continues to struggle with aging and beauty standards, Zsa Gabor's transformation stands as a particularly vivid example of how the pursuit of eternal youth can sometimes result in the loss of the very beauty it seeks to preserve.
When a girl meets boy.
5. Judy Garland, the girl who grew old too soon. When 16-year-old Judy Garland skipped down the yellow brick road in 1939's The Wizard of Oz, she captured America's heart with her fresh-faced innocence and powerful voice. With her wholesome features, expressive brown eyes, and infectious smile, Garland embodied a natural, girl-next-door appeal that stood in contrast to the more glamorous screen goddesses of the era. But behind that innocent facade lurked a studio system that would ultimately destroy not just Garland's youthful appearance, but her health and eventually her life, creating one of Hollywood's most dramatic and heartbreaking physical transformations. From the beginning, MGM executives considered Garland's natural look problematic. Studio head Louis B. Mayer referred to her as "my little hunchback" and put her on a regimen of diet pills and amphetamines, while still a teenager, to maintain a camera-ready weight. These pills, combined with barbiturates to help her sleep after the stimulants kept her awake, began a lifelong cycle of addiction that would visibly age her far beyond her years. Judy was a teenager who looked like a teenager, recalled her Oz co-star Ray Bolger years later, but the studio wanted her body to look like an adult, while her face stayed childlike. It was an impossible, destructive standard that started her on those pills. They were essentially feeding speed to a child and acting surprised when there were consequences. The consequences became increasingly visible as Garland entered her 20s. Though still young, the effects of amphetamine use began to show in her face. The fresh, rounded cheeks thinned. Dark circles formed under her expressive eyes. Her skin, once dewy with youth, began to show signs of dehydration and stress. By her 30s, the transformation was becoming dramatic. Photographs from the early 1950s show a woman who appeared at least a decade older than her actual age. The cycle of weight loss and gain caused by her substance issues created a constantly changing appearance. Sometimes gaunt to the point of appearing ill, other times bloated from alcohol and medication. Garland's physical state fluctuated wildly, but always showed the strain of her lifestyle. The industry chewed her up, and the damage showed, observed her friend and fellow performer Lena Horne. Judy at 30 looked 45. It wasn't just the substances. It was the emotional toll, the constant pressure, the sense that she was always one performance away from being discarded. As Garland entered her 40s, the aging process accelerated even further. Her once shiny chestnut hair became brittle and dull, often hidden under wigs for performances. Her skin developed deep lines around her eyes and mouth, not the normal aging process of a woman in her 40s, but the harsh marks of chronic stress, insomnia, and substance abuse. Most noticeably, her eyes, once her most captivating feature, began to reflect the profound exhaustion and pain of her circumstances. In close-ups from her 1960s television series, the vibrant sparkle that had defined her screen presence had dimmed considerably, replaced by a weariness that was painful for longtime fans to witness. By 1969, when Garland died of an accidental overdose at just 47 years old, she physically resembled a woman in her late 60s. The autopsy reported that years of substance abuse had caused physical damage consistent with someone much older, including liver problems, heart damage, and kidney dysfunction. The innocent girl from Kansas had been aged prematurely by the very industry that had made her a star. Hollywood didn't just take Judy's youth, it took her future, wrote entertainment journalist Richard Wilson. The medications that kept her thin enough and energetic enough to satisfy studio demands ultimately stole decades from her life and aged her before audiences' eyes. What makes Garland's physical transformation particularly heartbreaking is how preventable it had been. Unlike some stars who aged poorly due to personal choices, Garland's premature aging began with studio-mandated amphetamines when she was still legally a child, a professional exploitation that set the stage for lifelong struggles. In one of her final interviews, a reporter tactlessly remarked on how much older Garland looked than her years. Her response revealed the painful awareness of her own transformation. "If you had lived my life, you'd look older than your years too." It wasn't just a defensive retort. It was the simple, tragic truth.
You're too fine. You won't have none of me, but you'll sit here all night looking at your naked female.
4. Bette Davis, the eyes that lost their luster. She had the most extraordinary eyes of any actress in Hollywood. Film critic Richard Corliss once wrote of Bette Davis. Those legendary eyes, large, expressive, and intensely communicative, helped make Davis one of the greatest actresses of the Golden Age. Combined with her distinctive facial structure and commanding presence, they created a unique beauty that, while not conventional by Hollywood standards, was undeniably magnetic. In her prime, Davis possessed what photographers called perfect features for film, the kind of face that registered every subtle emotion and commanded attention on screen. While never a traditional bombshell, her striking looks in films like Jezebel, Dark Victory, and now Voyager established her as one of the most captivating presences in American cinema. But Davis's famous assertion that old age ain't no place for sissies would prove prophetic in her own life. The physical transformation she underwent in her later years was among the most dramatic and difficult of any Hollywood star, a combination of natural aging, health crises, and the effects of lifelong habits that altered her famous features almost beyond recognition. Davis was a dedicated smoker from an early age, reportedly consuming up to 4 packs a day at the height of her habit. This alone would have aged her prematurely, but it was just one element of a lifestyle that included heavy alcohol consumption and constant high-stress working conditions. By her late 40s, the effects were becoming noticeable on her once striking face. The skin changes happened first, recalled her longtime makeup artist Robert Miller. That beautiful, expressive face began to show lines much deeper than normal for her age. The smoking had damaged the elasticity so severely that by 50, her skin had the quality you'd expect in someone 65 or 70. The transformation accelerated dramatically after Davis suffered a series of devastating health crises in her 60s. In 1983, while in France, she experienced a stroke that partially paralyzed the left side of her face. Though she worked diligently at rehabilitation, the stroke left permanent effects on her appearance, including a slight droop to the left side of her mouth that altered her once precise diction. Just weeks after the stroke, Davis was diagnosed with breast cancer, requiring a mastectomy. The combined physical impact of these serious health issues, along with the treatments they required, dramatically accelerated the aging process. When she returned to the public eye, fans were shocked by her transformation. The most heartbreaking change involved those famous eyes, the feature that had defined her screen presence. The bright, commanding gaze that had once hypnotized audiences appeared noticeably diminished. The stroke had affected her facial muscles, subtly altering the shape of her eyes, while years of smoking had yellowed the once clear whites. Most significantly, the expressive mobility that had made her gaze so captivating was compromised by the neurological effects of her stroke. Her talent endured, her body didn't, observed her co-star in The Whales of August, Lillian Gish. Watching Bette work through such physical limitations was like watching a great pianist perform with arthritic hands. The artistry was still there, but the physical instrument had betrayed her. Davis refused to retreat from public view despite her changed appearance. She continued acting, appearing in projects that sometimes uncomfortably highlighted the contrast between her current appearance and her legendary beauty. In her final significant role in The Whales of August, 1987, the camera did not shy away from close-ups that revealed the full extent of her transformation. Deep wrinkles, thinning hair, and most noticeably, those once extraordinary eyes, now faded and less expressive. What made Davis's physical decline particularly poignant was her complete awareness of it. Unlike some stars who seemed oblivious to how drastically they had changed, Davis spoke with characteristic bluntness about her appearance. When an interviewer tactlessly asked about her changed looks, she responded, "I earned every one of these damn wrinkles, and I'm not about to hide them now." In her final public appearances before her death in 1989, Davis's transformation was complete and profound. The striking, commanding presence had been replaced by a physically fragile figure who nonetheless maintained the fierce spirit that had defined her career. Her body had been ravaged by decades of smoking, drinking, stress, and illness, leaving a physical shell that bore little resemblance to the vital actress of the 1940s and 50s. As her friend and fellow actress Olivia de Havilland reflected after Davis's death, Bette faced physical decline with the same unflinching courage she brought to everything. She never hid from the camera. Even when her reflection must have been painful to confront, there was something heroic about her refusal to pretend. In an industry built on illusions, Davis's transformation stands as a stark reminder of mortality and the physical price often paid for a lifetime of hard living and harder working. The eyes that once captivated millions had dimmed, but the indomitable spirit behind them never wavered.
I beg your pardon?
I am Mrs. Stephen Haynes. Sorry, but I don't think I know you.
3. Joan Crawford, The Mask That Cracked. When Joan Crawford arrived in Hollywood in the 1920s, she brought with her not just ambition, but a face that would define an era. With her wide, expressive eyes, distinctive mouth, and striking bone structure, Crawford's appearance was so iconic that a single glance at her silhouette was enough for instant recognition. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, that face graced dozens of hit films, from Grand Hotel to her Oscar-winning turn in Mildred Pierce. What made Crawford's beauty so distinctive was its architectural quality, the strong, clearly defined features that photographed dramatically from any angle. Unlike the softer, rounder faces of many contemporaries, Crawford's look was bold, modern, and unmistakable. As legendary photographer George Hurrell, who created many of Crawford's most famous portraits, once observed, "Joan had a face built for shadows and angles. It was impossible to take a bad picture of those features." But Crawford's legendary obsession with maintaining that famous face would eventually transform her into something that shocked even her most devoted fans. A cautionary tale about the dangers of refusing to surrender to time. From early in her career, Crawford was known for her almost pathological dedication to beauty maintenance. Her morning routine reportedly included splashing her face with ice water 25 times and applying a series of harsh astringents and alcohol-based toners that temporarily tightened the skin but caused long-term damage to its elasticity. Joan was at war with aging before she had even aged, recalled her longtime makeup artist, Richard Anderson. The preventative measures she took in her 30s and 40s were actually aging her skin prematurely, though the effects wouldn't become visible until years later. By her 50s, the first signs of this counterproductive regimen were becoming apparent. The harsh cleansing routines had stripped her skin of natural oils, creating a taut, slightly papery quality to her complexion. Her eyebrows, which she had plucked into oblivion in the 1930s and then drawn back in a dramatically arched shape, never fully regrew, forcing her to continue drawing them in an increasingly unnatural pattern that aged her appearance. Her obsessive about appearance intensified as she grew older, according to her daughter, Christina Crawford. The morning ritual expanded from 1 hour to 3. The face would be built rather than enhanced. Layers of products, techniques to create temporary lifts and shadows. It was like watching someone put on armor rather than makeup. Crawford's well-documented alcoholism accelerated the aging process dramatically. Heavy drinking leads to dehydration, broken capillaries, and puffiness, all issues that became increasingly visible in Crawford's once perfect features. Her attempt to counteract these effects led to even heavier application of makeup, creating a mask-like effect that grew more pronounced with each passing year. By the 1960s, Crawford's appearance had taken on a quality that film historian David Thompson described as a parody of her former self. The defined jawline that had been so striking in her youth appeared artificially rigid. The famous mouth, once perfectly painted in her signature dark lipstick, now seemed fixed in an unnatural shape that didn't move normally when she spoke. Most dramatically, her eyes, historically, her most captivating feature, became surrounded by makeup applied so heavily that it created a perpetual look of startled intensity. The eyebrows, drawn in a severe arch that bore no relationship to natural brow positioning, heightened this effect to sometimes alarming degrees. Her beauty faded. The anger didn't, observed her "Whatever happened to Baby Jane?" co-star Bette Davis, referring to both Crawford's physical transformation and the rage against aging that seemed to drive her increasingly desperate beauty routines. The final years of Crawford's life brought a tragic acceleration of her physical decline. As her career opportunities dwindled and her financial situation became precarious, she retreated from public view. Her rare appearances in the early 1970s shocked fans who remembered the glamorous star of just decades earlier. By her final years, even fans barely recognized her, noted her biographer Charlotte Chandler. The face that had been so uniquely, recognizably Joan Crawford had been transformed by a combination of age, alcohol, and increasingly desperate cosmetic interventions into something that bore little resemblance to her famous visage. In her last known photographs, taken in 1974, shortly before her withdrawal from public life, Crawford's transformation is complete and heartbreaking. The architectural features that had made her famous are almost completely obscured beneath heavy makeup. The skin appears unnaturally taut in some areas, while sagging in others. The carefully drawn lips and brows seem disconnected from the face they adorn. Most poignantly, the eyes that had once smoldered with ambition and intensity now peer out warily from a face that has become, essentially, a mask. When Crawford died in 1977, she left specific instructions that there be no funeral photographs or viewings. A final act of image control from a woman who had spent her life curating how the world saw her. Her physical transformation remains one of Hollywood's most stark reminders of the psychological toll exacted by an industry that worships youth and beauty above all else. As Crawford herself once prophetically observed early in her career, women's faces are lies. Wear enough makeup and men will believe any lie, even the most preposterous one of all, that we don't get old.
Oh, yes. Yes. Down below, they're waiting for the princess.
2. Gloria Swanson, natural aging in an unnatural world. When Gloria Swanson reigned as the queen of silent film in the 1920s, her beauty was considered so perfect that director Cecil B. DeMille insisted on photographing her from all angles. A rarity when most actresses had a preferred good side. With her luminous complexion, expressive eyes, and delicate features, Swanson epitomized the glamour of early Hollywood. In films like Male and Female and The Hummingbird, her face captivated audiences worldwide. Unlike many stars who disappeared as the silent era ended, Swanson successfully transitioned to sound films, though her megastardom gradually waned through the 1930s. By the time she made her triumphant comeback as Norma Desmond in 1950's Sunset Boulevard, Swanson was 50 years old, an age when most actresses of her generation had long since been relegated to character parts or retirement. What makes Swanson's place on this list unique is that unlike others who aged poorly due to lifestyle choices or excessive interventions, Swanson made the then revolutionary decision to age naturally, a choice that drew both admiration for its courage and shock for its results in an industry unprepared for realistic aging. She refused plastic surgery, which many admired, but fans were shocked at the contrast to her younger look, noted film historian Patricia Morrison. In the context of Hollywood's usual approach to aging, her natural changes seem more dramatic precisely because they weren't being artificially mitigated. Throughout her later years, Swanson maintained an admirable dedication to health that included a vegetarian diet, regular exercise, and abstention from alcohol and cigarettes, choices that should have helped her age well. And indeed, compared to contemporaries who smoked and drank heavily, her physical health remained excellent. However, even the healthiest lifestyle couldn't prevent the natural changes of aging on a face that had once been considered flawless. By the 1960s, when Swanson was in her 60s, the transformation from her silent film glory days was complete and striking. The perfect oval face had developed the natural jowls of aging. The smooth forehead now displayed the horizontal lines of 7 decades of expressiveness. Most noticeably, her neck, a feature Hollywood actresses often go to great lengths to preserve, showed the normal signs of aging with looser skin and visible banding. She was bold enough to face time, but time didn't care, remarked her friend and fellow actress Lillian Gish. In Hollywood, natural aging seems somehow more shocking than artificial preservation because we so rarely see it. Gloria showed tremendous courage in allowing herself to be seen as she actually was. This courage was particularly evident during Swanson's television appearances in the 1970s when she was in her 70s. While contemporaries like Joan Crawford had retreated from public view rather than be seen with their changed appearances, Swanson continued granting interviews and making public appearances with a confidence that defied Hollywood norms. The contrast between the fresh-faced silent film goddess and the naturally aged woman she became was indeed dramatic. Side-by-side comparisons of Swanson in her 1920s heyday and her 1970s television appearances show a transformation so complete that casual viewers might not recognize them as the same person. But unlike other entries on this list, Swanson's transformation represented the natural human aging process, albeit one that seemed particularly stark given how idealized her beauty had once been. The camera preserves youth in a way that creates impossible expectations, observed her longtime friend, director George Cukor. Gloria in her 70s looked exactly as a healthy woman in her 70s should look. The shock came from comparing that reality to films where she remains perpetually 25, perfect, and untouched by time. What makes Swanson's case so fascinating is how it highlights the double bind faced by aging Hollywood actresses. Those who pursued aggressive interventions were criticized for looking artificial, while those who aged naturally were described as having aged badly, simply for experiencing normal physical changes. In her 1980 autobiography, Swanson herself addressed this paradox with characteristic directness. "I've seen too many women trap themselves by trying desperately to stay attractive in a way that no longer suits them. Better to accept the natural changes and find a new form of beauty and maturity than to create a grotesque imitation of youth." When Swanson died in 1983 at age 84, obituaries invariably included side-by-side photos of the young glamour queen and the elderly woman she became, implicitly inviting readers to marvel at the transformation. What these juxtapositions rarely acknowledged was that Swanson's terrible aging was simply the natural human progression from youth to old age, a process that appeared dramatic only because Hollywood had conditioned audiences to expect women to remain perpetually in their prime. As her friend and Sunset Boulevard co-star Nancy Olson later observed, Gloria aged naturally, gracefully, and with dignity in an industry that considers natural aging to be both a failure and a form of surrender. Her real legacy isn't just her films, but but her courage in allowing herself to be a complete human being in an inhuman system.
I'm sorry you think more of your diamonds than you do of your soul.
I'm sorry you think more of my soul than you do of my diamonds.
1. Mae West, the bombshell who refused to fizzle. When Mae West sashayed onto movie screens in the 1930s, she brought a bawdy sexuality that revolutionized Hollywood. With her hourglass figure, platinum blonde hair, and perfectly painted face, West created an iconic image that was both glamorous and rebellious. In classics like She Done Him Wrong and I'm No Angel, her sultry appearance matched her suggestive dialogue to create a package that scandalized and delighted Depression-era audiences. Unlike many stars who were primarily known for their beauty, West's appeal combined physical attributes with her razor-sharp wit and boundary-pushing persona. She wasn't just sexually attractive, she was sexually autonomous in an era when that was rarely portrayed on screen. This distinction is crucial to understanding why, of all the actresses on our list, West's physical transformation in her later years was perhaps the most dramatic and unsettling. Because for Mae West, growing older didn't mean evolving her image. It meant freezing it in carbonite. She tried to maintain her bombshell image into her 80s, explained her longtime costume designer Robert Thomas. While other actresses of her generation transitioned to age-appropriate roles and appearances, Mae insisted on playing the same sexually voracious character she had portrayed in her 30s with the same visual presentation, despite the passing of 5 decades. This determination to maintain her bombshell status led to increasingly extreme measures as the natural aging process progressed. By her 60s, West's once natural blonde hair had been replaced by a series of increasingly elaborate platinum wigs that grew larger and more ostentatious with each passing year. The subtle makeup that had enhanced her features in her prime gave way to heavy applications that attempted to recreate her youthful appearance, but instead created an uncanny mask-like effect. Most noticeably, her wardrobe remained virtually unchanged from her 1930s heyday: skin-tight gowns, feather boas, and towering heels that had suited her curvaceous figure in youth, but created an increasingly jarring disconnect with her advancing age. By the 1970s, when she was in her 80s, the transformation was complete and unsettling, recalled film critic Richard Matthews, who interviewed West late in her career. The platinum wig had become an architectural structure that bore no relationship to human hair. The makeup was applied so heavily, it created a rigid mask that barely moved when she spoke. The famous hourglass figure was maintained through industrial-strength corseting that made natural movement impossible. The result was what many described as an almost waxwork quality, a three-dimensional recreation of Mae West, rather than the woman herself. Photographs from this period show a face so heavily powdered and painted that it appears almost like a mannequin, with exaggerated features that seem frozen in time. She looked like a wax figure melting in real time, observed comedian Phyllis Diller after encountering West at an industry event in the late 1970s. It was both sad and somehow impressive, the sheer force of will required to maintain that level of self-delusion. West's final film appearance in 1978's Sextet, when she was 85 years old, created uncomfortable viewing even for her most devoted fans. Playing a sexually irresistible woman pursued by men a third her age, West appeared on screen with her mobility visibly restricted by tight corseting, her face immobilized by heavy makeup, and her dialogue clearly dubbed in post-production as her actual voice had become too wavering to maintain her famous sensual delivery. What makes West's transformation particularly poignant is how it reflected her revolutionary spirit, even as it created an increasingly grotesque effect. The woman who had defied sexual conventions in the 1930s was now defying the convention that aging women should make themselves invisible. Mae refused to acknowledge aging, explained her biographer, Charlotte Chandler, but there was something almost feminist in her insistence on remaining sexually relevant long after society had deemed women of her age to be beyond such considerations. The execution became increasingly bizarre, but the underlying defiance was pure Mae. When West died in 1980 at age 87, she had maintained her bombshell persona literally until her final days. According to those close to her, she was still receiving her elaborate beauty treatments, still wearing her platinum wigs and tight gowns, still expecting to be treated as the sex symbol she had been half a century earlier. As cultural critic Susan Sontag later observed, West's transformation represented both the tragedy of Hollywood's impossible standards and a peculiar triumph of will. Mae West created a character in her youth that became a prison in her age. Yet she owned that prison, decorated it lavishly, and refused to acknowledge its walls even as they closed in around her. There's something both horrifying and admirable in such commitment. For modern viewers looking back at West's late career appearances, the visible gulf between her self-image and physical reality creates an uncomfortable viewing experience. Yet it also forces us to question why we find an elderly woman presenting herself as sexually desirable so disconcerting, a discomfort that reveals as much about our cultural attitudes toward aging as it does about West's unusual choices. In refusing to age gracefully by society's standards, West created the most extreme example of Hollywood's complicated relationship with time and beauty, a cautionary tale about denial, but also a brazen middle finger to the expectation that women should gracefully fade away when their youthful bloom has passed.